Serious. Today is Yom HaShoah, the day to remember the Holocaust, so people of Reddit with relatives who were in it managed to escape, or helped liberate a camp. What is their story? My mother's uncle was a survivor. I forget which camp he was in, but he was a Hungarian national. He came to America in 1950, and established himself as a skilled baker in New York City, and even baked for celebrities like the Rat Pack. He passed away about 3 years ago. Going through his stuff afterwards, his sons made a startling discovery: he had been living under an assumed identity and name ever since the end of the war. His family was gone, and while in the refugee camps, he met and befriended another family who had lost a son about his age. So in order to better everyone's chances of getting out into America, he assumed the son's identity, name, background, everything, and emigrated with them to the US. He lived under the son's identity for the next 60+ years. I think he gave the son's name a life well lived. Edit, grammar fixes and clarifications. Edit 2, spoke to my mom and she resent me some of the scans. Her uncle was originally from Romania, not Hungary, my mistake, sorry. He was at Auschwitz, Dachau, and a few other small ones. Also, for clarification, this was my mother's uncle by marriage. He married my grandfather's sister. I'm going to go through the scanned docs and post what I have. Give me a few days, I'm traveling, but we'll work on it when I get home. Thank you for asking this question. With this generation getting older, it's worrisome to think we may lose some of these stories forever. My grandfather was living in Poland when the Nazis invaded. At that time his father had already passed away, but the rest of his family were sent to the camps. His mother and youngest brother and sister were immediately gassed. His older sister was sent to a women's-only camp. He and his brother were kept together. I cannot for the life of me remember exactly what camp they were in first, but I remember the exact way my grandpa always told this story and the many times I heard him speak. In this first camp everyone was sent down into coal mines. He would always recall one particular day when he forgot his candle, which is pretty much a death sentence down there. His older brother took the blame, and a guard who seemed to have taken a shine to the two boys only beat my great-uncle instead of sending him to a gas chamber. Shortly after that they were separated. My grandfather was sent to Auschwitz where he helped to dig mass graves. One day a guard was distracted and my grandpa seized the opportunity. The guard pursued him and shot him. He woke up days later in a liberation camp. In the time it took him to regain consciousness, his brother had been found and brought to him. They received sponsorship from a rabbi in America and made plans for their trip. A few days before their departure an old neighbor spotted them on the street. "Your sister is alive and headed for Israel." The three were reunited and came to America together. My great-aunt passed about 25 years ago and my great-uncle about 5. My grandpa is still alive, though. His health is failing, but I'm glad he's still here. I've got a few, but I'll focus on some stories from my maternal grandfather, who was 12 years old when he, his father, and stepmother were removed from their home in Austria and placed into a Viennese Jewish ghetto. They had been in the ghetto for a week or two when this happened, I believe. They of course had heard whispers of other Jewish families disappearing, not yet knowing where exactly they were being sent. One evening, they heard a knock on their door. 2 uniformed SS officers were there, and they told my great-grandfather that he needed to gather his family and come with them, as there was a transport train waiting for them. My grandfather had caught a glimpse of one of these officers, and noticed that he wore a medal from World War I pinned to his chest. He recognized it because his own father had the very same medal. He and this Nazi had fought together, on the same side, during the war. Upon realizing this, my grandfather started digging madly through his father's few remaining belongings, fortunately digging up the medal he was looking for. He ran, sobbing and waving the medal, to the front door, saying, "You are brothers in arms. You are brothers in arms. You cannot take us away." The 2 SS officers stepped away and examined the medal, whispering unheard comments to one another. They came back, and handed the medal to my great-grandfather. They told him, "We will be back at dawn. If you are not here, we don't know what happened to you." As soon as the officers left, they gathered their meager belongings, sewing their valuables into the lining of their coats. They fled the country under the cover of night, not stopping until they reached Genoa, Italy. There, they managed to acquire 3 tickets on the second-to-last ship leaving the country. This ship traveled from country to country, trying to find a place which would accept Jewish refugees. Eventually, they landed at port in Shanghai, China, which accepted the men, women, and children who had been living aboard the ship. Ultimately, my grandfather lived there for over a decade, living through the Japanese occupation. His parents fell ill, and he was the only one of his family able to work for money. His first official job was as a snake catcher and venom collector for a medical facility. He moved on to selling stolen goods on the street. Eventually, he began to teach himself English so he could acquire a secretarial job with the United States Army. While he was there, he was one of 5 survivors of an accidental bombing, where dozens of Jews and Chinese were obliterated in seconds. Though he lost everything he had, and lived in abject poverty in a foreign country, he was one of the lucky ones in my family. At least 15 of my cousins, mostly children, were gunned down in front of their parents and older siblings as they were too young to work in camps. Those who were old enough were torn away from their spouses, children, parents, and siblings, never to see them again. This day always fills me with such a hollow sadness. My family is small. But I don't think it would have been so small had this horrendous genocide not happened. So many of my relatives were killed, starved, and tortured. God knows how many cousins I would have today if they had lived a normal life. Anyways, thanks for listening. I have more stories from my grandfather and other members of my family if there is any interest. Edit. In case anyone is interested, there is a fascinating history around the Shanghai Ghetto, which was also known as the restricted sector for stateless refugees. Read more here. My great-grandmother had the numbers tattooed on her arm from being in the camps. When she went to her granddaughter's wedding in 1964, some people begged her to wear a gown with longer sleeves, to cover up the numbers. She refused. Damn, she was a staunch old battle axe. My uncle was smuggled out of Poland as a 5-year-old child, just as shit was hitting the fan. A Christian couple who lived on his street convinced my uncle's parents to give him to them. So he was given to the Christian couple, who pretended he was their child, and then they fled the country pretending to go on vacation. He's in his 80s now, and has managed to find historical records about his family and relatives, but he was never reunited with any of his family ever again. Edit. My uncle married into the family. My family is from Ukraine in both sides, and all my grandparents were affected in one way or another. On my maternal side, my grandmother, she was 16 when the Germans started bombing Ukraine, managed to escape with her family and all but one sibling by being put on a train to Kazakhstan by the military right before the full invasion. The building her family lived in was bombed several days before, so they were lucky enough to have a suitcase with valuables that they sold along the way to make ends meet. Her brother, who was a soldier, never came back. Her grandmother, who was too old to leave, was identified by her neighbor as a Jew when the Nazis came. She never got to finish high school, but managed to get a decent job when she got back to Ukraine. She still has a hang-up about eating bread, which they had to ration while living in Kazakhstan. On my paternal side, I mostly know stories from my grandfather. He was a soldier in the Soviet army and towards the end of the war helped to liberate one of the smaller camps. One of his brother never made it back. Most of the stories he told me were light-hearted in nature. I don't know what else he has seen, but I am sure he would not have wanted to share it with a kid. He had a whole slew of medals from the war that he would wear with the other veterans during memorial parades. All in all, my family was very lucky given how many Soviet soldiers died and how many Ukrainian Jews were murdered. My Oma, who is still alive at 95, is an Auschwitz survivor. This is going to be a bit of a long story, but I like to share this whenever I have the chance. Oma is the youngest of 8, so many of her brothers and sisters had children. My Oma, one of her sisters, one of her brothers and one of her nephews were the only ones to survive the war. Her mother died before the war, her father committed suicide just before her family was taken by the Nazis. No one knows what happened to her sister. She was placed in a mental hospital after the war because she was no longer able to care for herself due to what we assume was incredible trauma. She never spoke of what happened to her during the war before she passed 17 years ago. Her brother went into hiding before the Nazis came and gave his 4-year-old son, my Oma's one surviving nephew, to a Christian family. Her nephew's given name is Moritz, but the family he stayed with called him Hans, a much less Jewish-sounding name, and he still goes by Hans. He lives in Amsterdam with his wife, children and grandchildren. My Oma went into the camps at 14 and got out at 18 when Auschwitz was liberated. She then spent time in a displaced persons camp recovering, before her brother heard her name on the radio as they were listing survivors and wrote her to come home. We don't know a lot of what happened to her during that time. She largely refuses to speak of it because the memories are too painful, but I know a few things. In one camp the guards would line them up each day and select who would be sent to the gas chambers. One day Oma was pulled forward, but managed to sneak back into the line and pinch her cheeks to look healthier, thus avoiding being killed that day. She once managed to steal a piece of raw meat from a kitchen, and told me it was the best thing she had eaten in years. Every day she would try to find some water to wash her underwear in, so she could feel at least a little clean and hold on to some of her humanity. I think perhaps most devastatingly she once looked at me and said, "Some of my sisters were shot in front of their children, some of my sisters had their children shot in front of them. I don't know which was worse." We're not certain if this is because of something that happened in the camps, or because she was largely starved during her adolescence, but she has never menstruated and was unable to have children. My mother is adopted. There is another story she likes to tell as a joke. She explains that she was packed on a train car being transported to another concentration camp, and the Allies, not realizing there were people on board not supplies, were bombing the trains. She says they all huddled down as best they could and covered themselves with the few blankets they had. At this point she grins and asks, "The fuck would the blankets have done?" Then cackles. It's both horrifying and kind of hilarious. We figure she's allowed to joke about it if she wants, but no one ever quite feels comfortable laughing too. I think she amuses herself with that. After she came back to Amsterdam she eventually met my Opa at a dance. They married, immigrated to Canada together, and were married for 50 years before he died. He spent every day of his life trying his best to make up for what she lived through. She currently lives with my parents, and very recently got to meet her first great-grandchild, my nephew. She is an incredible woman, and seems to be willing to tell me more and more about what she went through as time passes. I write it all down so that we can all remember, and hopefully to honor her and her family. Edit. Thank you all for the love, and the gold. Oma means the world to me and I'm so grateful to share her story. It brings me comfort to know that people want to remember. My Nana and her family ended up spread around various camps during the war because of Jewish relatives and/or because they were Czech. She has so many stories, but a slightly nicer one is of how her aunt survived Dachau because she played cards with the Guard soldiers. She played well enough that it was a challenge, but lost enough to make them think they were good. They'd keep her safe because she was a good source of entertainment. My Nana traveled to the UK after the war and married my granddad. She's an amazing woman and still kicking well into her 80s. My great-grandfather was a Protestant Christian from Germany who was very against what the Nazis stood for. In 1940, he was caught trying to smuggle Jews out of the country and to safety, sent to a prison where he was tortured into submission for a few years, let out on parole when he promised he would join the Nazis but was again caught helping Jews. He got shot in the arm, ran away and hid out in Russia until he had the reassurance and security to return. He didn't get a chance to go back until 1948, and when he did it was with a colorful array of mental problems, as well as a limp arm that was practically useless. When my grandmother talks about him she always looks very intimidated, and describes how frightening his outbursts could get, ranging from curled up crying and mumbling to himself, walking around with no motivation, just because he couldn't bear to stay still, and often just completely losing his temper and screaming at the world. I'm sorry to say he was also abusive to my grandmother and her sister. It's awful to think of what that man went through, and just because he knew what was trying to do the right thing and help innocent people, and I am so proud of him, to be a descendant of him, as mad as he might have gone. From a coworker, though I did meet the person concerned shortly before she passed away a couple of years ago. Mother was a Russian Jew living in a town outside Kiev in 1941. Youngest child of 3, IIRC. The German invasion really didn't trouble her at first. At 8 years old you really don't pay attention to grown-up stuff like that. As the summer wore on though she noticed her parents becoming more and more worried. Sometime in August her parents put her on train with a suitcase and sent her to live with her sister further east. They were going to stay to look after the family business. The Germans completely encircled Kiev on the 17th of September and mother never saw her parents again. Perhaps they perished at Babi Yar, but that scene was repeated in scores of towns and villages and no one was really taking names. Mother stayed with her sister for a few weeks until they were both evacuated even further east. They wound up working in a factory without a roof and sleeping in shelters put up in the factory itself. One of my uncles liberated one of the smaller camps in the latter part of the war. I asked him about it late in his life and he would only say, "Imagine the worst thing you can think of." It was worse than that and he would not speak of it anymore. No one deserved what the people in the Holocaust suffered. I had a relative whose unit did that too. Nice guy, but he apparently held up a whole town at the point of a tank with a threat not to intervene if the recently liberated victims took food. He was furious that they claimed they didn't know about the camp when he said you could smell the death and burning bodies everywhere. Unfortunately, it turns out that eating too much after prolonged starvation will also kill you. I think it haunted him. Refeeding syndrome. The insulin spike causes the potassium and phosphate in your blood to be pushed inside the cells, leaving perilously low levels in the blood. This can lead to seizures and death. It can happen in as little as 5 to 7 days without food. I can't imagine how bad it must have been for people who were actually starving. That's why you also need to closely monitor food intake with obviously starving, malnourished animals. You can't just let them free feed, inhale food and water upon rescue. It's heartbreaking that nourishment can kill the starving. I attended a talk by a Holocaust survivor in school a fair while ago. Many of the details escape me now, but the part that's always stuck in my mind is his description of the end of his ordeal. He just survived a concentration camp and a death march, and possibly a sea voyage at the end of that, but my memory is a little hazy, before being liberated by American soldiers. The Americans were in a town and just told all the rescued people to eat what they wanted. The man said he saw people dead in the street with bread sticking out of their mouths. He also thought more people died that day than died on the death march. That kind of chills me because my relative had mentioned a bakery and that was the type of situation his unit created when they liberated the camp. They told the townspeople to back off and for the victims to help themselves. I don't remember the name of the camp, but I wonder if it was the same one? My maternal grandma was sent to the UK by her parents at 14. Her parents had their journey scheduled but for a later date. 3 days before their train, the Nazis came to Austria and her parents were killed. She grew up in the UK with her aunt. She was a brilliant woman, her English was perfect, and in her 70s she finally had the chance to complete her A-levels. My cousin is currently in Poland marching to remember. It's a weird time for me. My grandparents only met because they both escaped to England. He was also a survivor but died when I was very young. I think the most important thing to remember, at least for me, is the life my grandma had because she survived. I have never wanted to focus on the horrors that got her here, but more on the wonderful light she gave to our lives. People are still doing many evil things around the world. So many lights are still going out too soon. I try my best to make an effort to remember the lives that were lost and what made them who they were. My grandma never wanted to be remembered as the orphaned 14-year-old, stranded in a foreign country. She wanted to be remembered as a strong woman, a loving mother and grandmother. If she was here with me, she'd ask me to write about how much she loved Shakespeare and how she was an aspiring actress. She'd say how proud she is of her son and daughter and lives they've made. We lost her to esophagus cancer 14 years ago and not a day goes by I don't miss her. Thanks for watching our video. If you like it, please smash the subscribe and like button to support the channel, so that we can create more quality content in the future.